Rise of the European Emperor by Taishan Laonyo.
Chapter 671, Escape Without a Fight. In the eyes of the nobles, Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, was a well-educated and polite young nobleman. However, that was only limited to when facing nobles. When facing civilians, Henry Percy had a different face. In the name of suppressing bandits, Henry Percy arrested many refugees on the charge of collaborating with bandits and then forced them to go north. Therefore, the 20,000 refugees in Leicestershire were basically captured by him. However, Henry Percy was not satisfied. After all, Northumberland is a large county of more than 5,000 square kilometers. Before, there were only tens of thousands of people, which was obviously underdeveloped. You know, in this era, because there were no machines. Therefore, agricultural activities were basically completed by manpower. Therefore, a large population is needed to fully develop Northumberland. Before this, the Earls of Northumberland had tried to recruit immigrants. However, Northumberland is located in the northernmost part of England. Not only is it not as warm as the south, it is also vulnerable to attacks from the Kingdom of Scotland in the north. Therefore, there are very few people willing to move to Northumberland. The population of England is mainly concentrated in several southeastern counties near London. But this time is different. With the opportunity of Richard Bolle being replaced, the shrewd Henry Percy saw a huge opportunity. There are hundreds of thousands of refugees in several central counties. If they are all brought to his own Northumberland, the development level of Northumberland will definitely be greatly improved. Today, Northumberland is mainly based on sheep farming. In addition to the reason that wool is popular, there is also the helplessness of insufficient labor. After all, farming requires a lot of people. Therefore, Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, desperately fought for the opportunity to become the head coach this time. He planned to make a lot of money by sending troops to the north this time. At least, he had to plunder enough labor. After having this idea, Henry Percy naturally deliberately led the army to take the chaotic central route, instead of the western route that Richard Bolle had planned to take before. In the name of suppressing bandits, Henry Percy sent troops to suppress bandits. But at the same time, he sent his trusted generals and soldiers to capture those refugees from the north. As for the reason for arresting people, it was naturally collusion with bandits. After being arrested, the whole family was taken away and followed the army to the north. After cleaning up Leicestershire, Henry Percy was surprised to find that only more than 10,000 refugees were arrested. Didn't they say there were more than 100,000 refugees? This was also because Henry Percy's intelligence lagged behind. The number of more than 100,000 refugees was no problem, but that was the year before last. Because the food was robbed, most of the refugees in the northern counties naturally went south to beg for food or find grass roots and tree bark to eat. The northern counties were eaten up. But since last year, many northern refugees who survived have chosen to return home. After all, the bark and grass in their hometowns have grown well. Of course, it would be better if some grain seeds could be taken back for planting. In addition, Marin also immigrated tens of thousands of refugees. Therefore, there are only 50,000 to 60,000 refugees left in several central counties. Moreover, many people have joined the thieves group. Under such circumstances, Henry Percy naturally couldn't catch any refugees. In desperation, Henry Percy suddenly came up with a plan. In order to take away enough people, he sent some trusted officers, with his soldiers, dressed as thieves from a bandit group, to rob the homes of local people in Leicestershire, and rob the local farmers' homes into poverty and unable to survive. Then, Henry Percy sent another group of men to appear as saviors, mobilizing these local unfortunate people who had lost everything to go to Northumberland in the north to live a good life. If they couldn't survive, what could the local farmers who were cheated do? They had to follow. Later, Henry Percy provided them with very limited food. In fact, the food was originally robbed from their homes. Relying on this despicable method, Henry Percy took away more than 10,000 people from Leicestershire, bringing the refugee team to as many as 30,000 people. Then, Henry Percy was satisfied and continued to move north with his army. Because he did not dare to offend Thomas Stanley, the Earl of Derbyshire, Henry Percy's army did not pass through Derbyshire, but went to Nottinghamshire to the east of Derbyshire. And Nottinghamshire is also the place where the Robin Hood thieves are entrenched. The reason why Leicestershire and Nottinghamshire were chosen as the targets is that Leicestershire and Nottinghamshire currently have no lords, and they belong to unowned lands. It will not be until the mid to late 16th century that earls will be granted to these two counties. Even if the population is robbed here, no one will be offended. Unlike Derbyshire, Thomas Stanley, the Earl of Derbyshire, is too powerful. He is the king's stepfather and cannot be offended. When Henry Percy led his army into Nottinghamshire, he was inevitably in conflict with the Robin Hood thieves. However, when Henry Percy's army was rampant in Leicestershire, Coster and Merrick, the leaders of the Robin Hood thieves, asked Marin how to deal with it. After careful consideration, Marin decided to let the Robin Hood thieves retreat and temporarily avoid the sharp edge. It's not that the Robin Hood thieves were afraid of Henry Percy's army. After all, even if the Robin Hood thieves couldn't beat Henry Percy, it was still safer to hide in the jungle. However, Marin considered that he needed to encourage the arrogance of his opponents, so he asked Coster and Merrick to take the initiative to retreat. The Robin Hood thieves, who once caused trouble and gave the king a headache, fled without a fight. How much did Henry Percy's self-confidence increase? 7,000 or 8,000 thieves chose to escape, which would inadvertently encourage Henry Percy's arrogance. After all, the other party was a 27-year-old young man. In this case, wouldn't he be crazy? Coster and Merrick decisively chose to follow Marin's order. They took their men, packed up, and fled to the northwest Pennine Mountains under the watchful eyes of the British Scout Cavalry to join Marin. Of course, in order to make the escape more realistic, the Robin Hood thieves fled in all directions at first when they withdrew from Sherwood Forest. Except for the south where the British army was, thieves fled in the other three directions. But the British scouts didn't know that the thieves in these three directions would eventually run towards the mountainous area of the Pennines in the northwest, and at most make a detour. As expected by Marin, Henry Percy, who was still plundering people in the south of Nottinghamshire, heard that the thieves of the Robin Hood thieves group in Sherwood Forest in the north of Nottinghamshire fled in all directions after learning that his army had arrived. This made Henry Percy's self-confidence explode. My reputation is so lethal. Before reaching the north of Nottinghamshire, the group of thieves ran away first, and there were 7,000 or 8,000 thieves. So Henry Percy immediately wrote a letter to Henry VII to report his glorious achievements. Henry VII and Thomas Stanley were also a little confused. Wasn't the leader of that thieves group a French knight? Why didn't he run away without causing trouble for the British army? Could it be because he lost confidence after learning the bad news that the main force of the French army was destroyed? Well, it should be like this. Chapter 672 The 5th Legion. Southeast of Yorkshire, north of the Humber River. Sivag, the former highest military commander of the West Frisian Noble Republic, has been here for several months. With the help of the Robin Hood thieves, led by Coster and Merrick, Sivag and his trusted officers successfully recruited 10,000 young and strong men from the refugees in several counties in central England and began training. And these 10,000 English recruits were organized into the 5th Legion by Marin. Marin's legion organization is 4,000 more than the 6,000 people of the ancient Roman legion, which can form 8 square formations. And because of the shortage of muskets and ammunition, and the fact that there are many good archers among the English. Therefore, this legion is similar to the 4th Legion of Saqqara, which is also mainly composed of English soldiers, and both use bows and arrows as long-range weapons. Although it has been trained for several months in the southeast of Yorkshire north of the Humber River, Sivag still has little confidence in this brand new 5th Legion. After all, although these recruits look like dogs during training, they are pleasing to the eye. But when they are really on the battlefield, they are all rookies, and something bad might happen. Facing the experienced 20,000 British troops, Sivag does not think that the 10,000 English recruits of the 5th Legion have any combat effectiveness. After being hit by several rounds of arrows from the English longbowmen, they might cry and call for their mothers. In fact, not only Sivag has no confidence in the 5th Legion, but Marin also has no confidence in the 5th Legion. The fighting will of English soldiers is not as strong as that of the Germans. Although there is Saqqara's food temptation training method to help train, there is no bottom at all how much combat effectiveness they have. So, after consideration, Marin decided to let these 10,000 troops go to York City to assist Edward's original 10,000 troops in defending the city. Marin was not at ease with those French soldiers, fearing that they would resent Edward and surrender to the British. Therefore, sending another 10,000 people over there would also give them confidence. In addition, for new recruits, there is no better way to exercise than defending the city. On the front battlefield, recruits may collapse due to the impact of the enemy. But in the battle of defending the city, because of the huge advantage of the tall and solid city walls, the recruits have something to rely on in their hearts, so it is not easy to collapse. You know, in the battle of defending the city, let alone the trained recruits, even the civilians with no military skills can push the weapons to the city wall to participate in the defense. Moreover, it is more effective. After all, the solidity of the city wall gives those soldiers who are not veterans a great sense of security. Therefore, Marin intends to use this battle of defending the city of York to train the recruits, let them see blood, and exercise their courage in courage. Soldiers who have seen blood are very different from those who have not seen blood. Soldiers in peacetime look cool in the military parade, but they may not work when they are really on the battlefield. Because the military parade is completely different from the war. The peaceful soldiers in the military parade look serious, but their muscles are actually very tight. Don't look at the bluffing look, in fact, those soldiers may be more nervous than you. But veterans who have seen blood are different. Those who can crawl out of the pile of dead bodies on the battlefield are either mentally collapsed or don't care about anything, they don't care about death, so their faces are full of indifference and coldness. So, the same serious expression, the new recruits who have never seen blood and the veterans who have fought hundreds of battles are different. The peace soldiers who have never seen blood have serious expressions on their faces because they are nervous and cautious, while the veterans who have seen blood don't care about anything and are a little numb to life, so they don't even bother to have expressions on their faces. I'm not afraid of death, living is a waste of money, what should I be afraid of? When seeing strangers, bloodthirsty veterans may regard you as a human head, and there is no difference between killing you and killing a chicken in their minds. And their eyes with the expression of killing a chicken suddenly, sensitive people will regard it as murderous intent. Because the bloodthirsty veteran in front of you may really be thinking about how to kill you, thinking about where to cut you and get rid of you in one go. Don't get me wrong, he doesn't really want to kill you, but he is used to killing people. The veterans who are used will think about how to cut you with a knife, and those who use guns will think about where to hit you to make you die the fastest. This kind of indifferent and malicious eyes is what people call murderous intent. Marin himself is a knight, and he has some of these veteran habits. For example, when he sees other knights, he sometimes thinks about knocking the other person off the horse with a lance, or aiming at the other person's neck, thinking about how to use the saber to take the other person's head away when passing by the other person. In his previous life, Marin met a retired veteran who was a sniper. He was silent, but he always liked to look at people's eyebrows. Paralyzed, he was thinking about how to blow your head. This is purely a professional habit cultivated over a long period of time. Habits are terrible. When people are used to killing, they are either perverted wanted criminals or elite veterans. Only when you are used to killing and look lightly at life and death can you grow into a veteran of hundreds of battles. Therefore, Marin plans to send the newly formed 5th Legion to York City, take the initiative to replace the French in charge of the city's defense, and face the siege of the English army. Although some people may die, after this battle, most of the wartime will get used to the cruelty of the battlefield. As for those who really can't adapt, it can also be seen through the cruel defense of the city. Then, either execute or kick out of the army. The 5th Legion is very useful to Marin. After Edward occupied London, it was impossible to rely on the French to help him defend the city. Otherwise, Edward himself would be afraid. Therefore, Edward needs an army belonging to the brand new Kingdom of England. Of course, in the short term, Edward will find it difficult to find a suitable army to protect himself. Therefore, Marin will definitely select one from the 4th Legion of Saqqara and the 5th Legion of Sivag, and temporarily be ordered to protect Edward and let Edward through the difficult stage. After all, these 2 legions are composed of English people, and it is more convenient for Edward to use them. As for which one to choose, it depends on Edward's preference. After Edward has gained a foothold, he will definitely form his own direct army. Then, this army will definitely be marginalized. But it doesn't matter. After all, after Edward succeeds, Marin will become the new Earl of Northumberland and the Lord of the Isle of Wight. At most, they will be transferred to guard Northumberland and the Isle of Wight. Marin estimated that Edward would be more likely to choose the 5th Legion. After all, the 5th Legion is a newly formed legion, and its loyalty to Marin, the Old Master, is not very high. In this way, Edward has the opportunity to win over. Therefore, Marin needs to quickly form the combat effectiveness of the 5th Legion. After all, Marin must return to Germany with the main force after the battle. If the 5th Legion has never seen blood, is too cowardly, and is finally overturned by the remnants of Henry VII, it would be a shame. If he sends troops to attack England again, it will be troublesome. If he accidentally lets his daughter-in-law Princess Margaret be killed by the rebels, then Marin will have no legal basis to rule England in the future. Maybe with hard power, Marin can indeed suppress the English wastes by force. However, there will definitely be resistance and uprisings in the future, which will be a headache. Marin cannot guarantee that his descendants will be proficient in military affairs and subdue the whole of England. If he fails, he will be sent to the guillotine. Therefore, it is better to obtain the throne of England through legal means. For this reason, Marin specially modified the battle plan. He planned to leave with 5,000 accompanying veterans after the 5th Legion arrived in York City, and hand over York City to the 5th Legion for defense. Moreover, he will not attack the English army from behind immediately, but let the 5th Legion fight with the English army for a while. After the new recruits of the 5th Legion have seen enough blood, they will send out the main force to launch an attack from behind and completely eliminate the English army. Chapter 673, Seeking Peace. In order to prevent Henry Percy from knowing the existence of the 5th Legion, Marin was also racking his brains. First of all, he asked Sivag to lead the 5th Legion to hide during the day and travel at night, and to take remote roads to avoid being seen by too many people. You know, there are many people and eyes. If a passerby accidentally reveals the news to Henry Percy, then the other party will definitely treat it with caution. After all, facing 10,000 people and facing 20,000 people are two completely different concepts. However, in this way, the marching speed is greatly reduced. Because everyone can see the road during the day, but when marching at night, the road is not clear, and they can only grope while walking, so the marching speed naturally cannot be raised. They are not guerrillas who are used to walking at night, and the marching speed in the middle of the night must be greatly affected. Fortunately, Henry Percy was too selfish and was busy plundering the population in Nottinghamshire, so he was not in a hurry to go north. Otherwise, the 5th Legion would not be able to arrive in York before the English army. Secondly, Marin also had to keep the news of the ambush he led secret. In order to prevent the news of his ambush from leaking out, Marin sent scout cavalry to block the road leading out of York every night, and intercepted suspected spies who rode out of the city in the middle of the night. He killed them on the spot without listening to the advice. Relying on this method, Marin barely ensured that no one would pass on the news that he brought 5,000 soldiers into York. In fact, there were still a few spies belonging to Henry VII who were hidden deeper among Edward's guards. However, because of the ambush incident, they did not dare to show up. In addition, after the incident with Guard Allen, Edward no longer trusted his guards. Now, Edward's security work is temporarily taken over by the people brought by Marin. After all, the soldiers from Germany will not have anything to do with Henry VII. In order to prevent the leakage of information, Edward's hundreds of English guards were all monitored by Marin's men. Even if those spies who were hidden deeply wanted to pass on information, they did not dare. If he moved, he might be killed on the spot. With these two measures, Marin didn't believe that Henry VII's men could still obtain intelligence. However, before leading his 5,000 troops to evacuate York, Marin suddenly remembered that he had brought 5,000 troops into the city, and it seemed that he had seen a lot of people from the Pennines to York. If Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, sent his men to the west of York to rob food during the siege, and accidentally learned that there were 5,000 troops hiding in the western mountains, then the other party would definitely be on guard against his sneak attack. In desperation, Marin had to think of a stupid way. All the people in the villages and towns he saw on his army's original marching route were kidnapped and taken back to the mountains. In this way, no one who knew the news of his army would know the news. As for the insiders in York, that would have to wait until Henry Percy could capture York. But Marin couldn't give him this opportunity. In this way, Marin had to take his men and the 2,000 or 3,000 local residents along the way into the mountains together. With the addition of the 7,000 or 8,000 thieves from the Robin Hood bandits who escaped from Nottinghamshire, the camp in the mountains suddenly had more than 10,000 people. With more than 10,000 mouths, the supply of food suddenly became tight. In desperation, Marin had to send someone to Newcastle as fast as possible to notify the logistics troops there to transport food from the Humber River in the south of Yorkshire by boat. Then, let the people from the Robin Hood bandits go to the river to meet them. In this way, there will be no shortage of food. Even if Henry Percy knew about this, he would not think of his own army. Because the Robin Hood bandits would raise flags to draw hatred for their regular army. And Henry Percy didn't bother to pay attention to the thieves hiding in the mountains before he captured York City. Because the importance of the two is completely incomparable. Henry Percy's 20,000 English troops were very slow. It was not until Newcastle transported the food to Marin through the Humber River that Henry Percy's army ended the looting of Nottinghamshire's population, food and property. However, in a blink of an eye, he led his troops to Lincolnshire in the east to suppress bandits. Lincolnshire is very large, nearly 6,000 square kilometers, more than twice the size of Nottinghamshire, and has a larger population. Henry Percy thought, if he entered Lincolnshire to loot, there would definitely be more people and property. However, his generals were not happy. Looting such an ownerless county would certainly make a fortune, but Henry Percy ate the meat, and they only drank some leftover soup. Not only was there little benefit, but it was also very time-consuming. You know, everyone was counting on defeating Edward's army and establishing merit so that their titles could be promoted or their fiefs could be increased. Lincolnshire is so big that if they were to rob it, the daylilies would be cold. Therefore, many officers jointly reported Henry Percy's unprofessional behavior to Henry VII. After being reprimanded by Henry VII in a letter, Henry Percy finally restrained himself, stopped robbing in Lincolnshire, and began to organize a large army to cross the Humber River and march towards Yorkshire. Seeing that the British army finally entered Yorkshire, Marin had nothing to do, so he discussed with Edward how to trick Henry Percy again, so that he would be more proud and conceited. "Your Majesty, how about we write a letter of peace and send it to Henry Percy's camp to make him happy?" Marin, who was full of bad water, suggested. "Peace? Grand Duke Marin, are you kidding? I am the king granted by heaven, how can I ask for peace with a traitor?" Edward was a little angry. Marin quickly comforted him. "Your Majesty, we are not really asking for peace. It's fake, to let Henry Percy relax his guard." "Fake? But, it's a bit embarrassing. Edward is a traditional European noble after all, and he cares more about his face. Unlike Marin, a time traveler, he would call someone daddy for the sake of profit, as long as the profit is high enough to break the bottom line. It's just a lie, Your Majesty, don't mind it. As long as we can completely defeat these 20,000 troops, we can march south directly. And Your Majesty, you are the real King of England. So, what are these little tricks before?" Marin persuaded. "But, with our strength, it is enough to defeat them. There is no need to pretend to ask for peace." Edward said doubtfully. "My Majesty, the army is mine, of course I feel bad. Although we have many soldiers, there are also many enemies. If they are on guard, our sneak attack may become a hard battle. Even if we win, there will be huge losses. At that time, what can we use to go south to besiege London? After all, it is still the 20,000 main forces under my command who will go south to besiege London. The 20,000 troops in York City are not trustworthy by the French, and Sivag's new army is okay at defending the city, but it is impossible to expect them to besiege the solid London." Edward thought about it and felt that what Marin said made sense. So, he agreed to write a fake letter of peace. The letter was written by Marin himself. As for Edward, he felt embarrassed and did not participate. Marin said in the letter of peace, "Henry VII, let's not fight. You see, I also have 10,000 troops. If I defend York City, your 20,000 troops may not be able to take it down. Didn't you fail to take Dublin before? Otherwise, you can give Yorkshire to me, the only male heir of the York family, and then we can stop fighting." Marin has studied psychology, so he naturally knows what tone to use. In the letter of peace, Marin imitated Edward and used a tone that seemed very confident, but a little lacking in confidence. This is in line with Edward's real situation. When the peace letter was sent to Henry Percy's camp, Henry Percy laughed arrogantly. The other side had already given up before the fight even started, and the outcome was clear at a glance. Of course, he had no right to make the decision for Henry VII. So he sent someone to send the peace letter back to London, letting Henry VII make the decision. But at the same time, he commanded 20,000 troops to continue northward, to besiege York first. Chapter 674, The Siege Begins. The peace letter was sent to London. Henry VII laughed out loud after reading it. "Huh, Edward, this bastard, is finally scared this time." Henry VII saw the panic and fear of the other party from Edward's obviously lack of confidence. So, he felt particularly happy. After reading the peace letter, Thomas Stanley asked Henry VII. "So, Your Majesty, how do you think you should reply?" Neither of them suspected that the letter was a fraud, because, without knowing the existence of Marin's 20,000 troops hiding in the mountains, the appearance of this peace letter was in line with Edward's current desperate situation. Edward's biggest foreign aid, the French, were defeated by the British army, and there seemed to be no movement in Scotland. An Edward Sea route to retreat westward to the island of Ireland was also blocked. In this way, Henry VII and Thomas Stanley felt that Edward was in a desperate situation, and it was normal to ask for peace. After thinking for a while, Henry VII suddenly said with a ferocious face, "He wants to make peace. Dream on. He is the only male member of the York family and has been the crown prince. He is the biggest obstacle to the legitimacy of my king. If Edward is not dead, how can I be the king safely? He escaped from the Tower of London last time. This time, I must kill him." After a pause, Henry VII said, "By the way, his only daughter Margaret must not be spared." If a modern person heard that even a little girl was not spared, he would definitely protest. But Thomas Stanley himself was a vicious old fox, so naturally he had no objection. In this way, the two giants of the Tudor dynasty easily completed the decision. As for the other ministers, they did not dare to go against Henry VII's wishes. After all, Henry VII is a ruthless man, and he kills without blinking an eye. If Marin hadn't instructed Princess Margaret to use the trick of civet cat substitute prince, the weeds on Edward's grave would probably be half a person tall now. After notifying several other ministers, Henry VII ordered Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, "Edward must be captured, dead or alive. If Edward is captured, Henry Percy can take a large piece of land from the northern half of Yorkshire as an additional fiefdom. In addition, Edward's daughter, Margaret, must also be captured, dead or alive. As for Anna, it is not that important. However, if she is found to be pregnant when captured, someone will directly kick her in the abdomen to cause miscarriage." Faced with this vicious order, Henry Percy wiped his cold sweat after reading it. The seventh master is indeed vicious, and it is like living with a tiger. Then, Henry Percy led the main force of 20,000 British troops to surround York City. At this time, in York City, according to Edward's instructions before leaving, the new recruits of the 5th Legion sent by Marin temporarily took over the defense and were responsible for resisting the British attack. As for the 7,000 French troops and 3,000 German mercenaries, as a reserve force, they are mainly responsible for reinforcing dangerous areas at any time. French officer François Knight had no objection to such an arrangement. First of all, such an arrangement can reduce many casualties among French soldiers. In addition, before Edward left, he reiterated that as long as he won, he would get a count. However, the somewhat honest Knight François did not know that Edward had no intention of fulfilling this promise. Even after taking London, Edward planned to let his sister poison the Frenchman to prevent him from asking for the earldom from him. It is said that his sister Margaret got a very good chronic poison, and Princess Catherine of Spain died of this chronic poison. This thing is definitely a killer in the palace fight. After fighting with Henry VII for several years, Edward is no longer the rookie who was just replaced out of the Tower of London. Coupled with the inherent hatred between England and France, Edward did not trust the French at all. Moreover, under the guidance of his sister's letters, Edward also became a little cruel. Even Marin, Edward had thought about whether to poison him afterwards. But after thinking about it, he gave up. Why? Marin is not an Englishman. In Germany, Marin also has the powerful Principality of the Grand Duchy of the North Sea. If Marin is poisoned, it will cause national disputes. Moreover, after getting familiar with Marin, Edward knew that the navy under Marin was not weak. England was not afraid of France because the navy was stronger than the French. But the navy of the Grand Duchy of the North Sea has dozens of warships, all of which are equipped with artillery, and may not lose to the English navy. Of course, that also depends on Marin's performance afterwards. If Marin stays in England and reveals his ambitions for England, Edward will still plan to poison him. If Marin returns to Germany after taking the benefits, Edward will decide to continue to be friends with him. Because even as the King of England, he needs a strong ally. Marin has a strong army, and maybe he still needs his help. Marin, who was drinking with Edward, didn't know that Edward, who was toasting with him enthusiastically, was thinking about whether to poison him. However, Marin was not a good bird. While Edward was thinking about whether to poison Marin, Marin was also calculating when to get rid of Edward's sister, Princess Margaret. Princess Margaret was a ruthless and powerful woman. If Edward became king, Princess Margaret would definitely become the female overlord of England's political arena. It would be bad if this crazy woman prevented Caesar from marrying Edward's daughter Princess Margaret. Moreover, if this woman killed little Margaret after Edward's death, the throne would belong to her son. In order to control England in the future, this woman must be eliminated. Marin made up his mind. However, the two people with ulterior motives had smiles on their faces that were about to overflow. Sure enough, there are no good birds in the political arena, good birds die halfway from the grassroots to the top. When Marin and Edward were drinking in the camp in the mountains, the British army finally launched a tentative siege on York City. In the first round of attack, because it was a test, the British army did not use much strength, but sent longbowmen to shoot arrows on the top of the city. It was originally just a tentative attack. If the opponents were all veterans, the longbowmen's projectiles would not have achieved much results. However, the bad thing was that most of the soldiers in the 5th Legion were recruits. Although Siwag and his officers reminded them in every possible way, some idiots still popped their heads out to watch the British army's actions. Then, the first round of shooting by the British longbowmen took the lives of more than a dozen stupid recruits. More than 30 were injured. And this round of arrow rain finally made these recruits understand the cruelty of the battlefield. Before, the officers had always emphasized that no mistakes were allowed on the battlefield. Because once you make a mistake, it means your death is coming. In the past, everyone thought that the officers were nagging, but after this round of arrow rain, everyone finally understood that making mistakes on the battlefield would really kill you. Those who were shot to death by the British arrow rain before were those who were usually mischievous and undertrained. During normal training, these people didn't take it seriously, and they still did their own thing after being punished. However, after the brutal baptism of the battlefield, everyone understood that the reminders of those experienced officers were important principles for saving lives on the battlefield. So, in the tense battlefield atmosphere, the recruits began to desperately recall the officers' usual teachings so that they could better adapt to the battlefield and save their lives in the brutal battle without running away. Chapter 675 Don't worry, wait and see. At the beginning of the siege, Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, the commander of the British Army, discovered a situation. There seemed to be a lot of new recruits on the opposite side. If they were experienced veterans, facing the rain of arrows shot by the longbowmen under the city wall, they would definitely hide behind the outer parapet on the top of the city. And because of the angle of the trajectory, the arrows shot could not hurt the people hiding behind the dugout parapet on the top of the city. Anyone who was injured in the first round of shooting must be a new recruit. As a result, after the first round of arrows, the British army under the city wall heard dozens of screams from the city wall. Obviously, there are many new recruits on the top of the city. Of course, they may not be new recruits, but simply civilians. After all, it is a common practice to let the civilians help defend the city. However, under normal circumstances, the civilians will only be pushed to the front line in critical situations or when the main soldiers are tired. Because the military literacy of the civilians is too low, if they are asked to defend the first baton, it is estimated that they can shake the morale of the army and lower morale. After all, in the cold weapon era and the semi-cold weapon era, wars were fought for morale and military spirit. If the military spirit was shaken and the soldiers were affected by the screams of the militia, then the war would be very difficult to fight. Therefore, Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, who had learned a lot of military knowledge, directly concluded that there were not enough troops in the city in many new recruits. Henry Percy even guessed that a lot of French troops in the city might have escaped. After all, the French were not fools when they saw that there was no hope. In this way, Edward would have to rely on the militia in the city to help defend the city, and push the militia to the front line right away. In this way, Henry Percy was directly excited. If his judgment was correct, then it might be much easier to capture York City. And if York City was captured and Edward and his daughter were captured, then it would definitely be a great achievement. According to Henry VII's promise, he could take away a lot of land in the north of Yorkshire. So, Henry Percy gave up the tentative attack after half a day and switched to a direct attack. The next time, it entered the formal offensive and defensive stage. But what confused Henry Percy was that the defenders on the top of the city, except for a lot of mistakes on the first day, performed better and better in the next few days. And the defense of York City is naturally becoming more and more stable. In fact, the new recruits of the 5th Legion on the top of the city still have a solid training foundation. Sivag and his confidants are experienced officers. After joining Marin, Sivag and his confidants learned many advanced training methods of the East Frisian army, including the food stimulation training method of Sakara. In this way, the 10,000 English recruits on the top of the city actually have a solid foundation. The situations on the first day were basically due to nervousness or carelessness. In the afternoon of the first day, the British army launched a fierce attack and almost broke through the defense on the city wall. For a time, hundreds of British soldiers rushed up and almost stunned the new recruits on the top of the city. Fortunately, there were 7,000 French veterans and 3,000 German mercenaries on standby at the foot of the city wall. With their support, the new recruits of the 5th Legion on the city wall did not collapse. But after the first day of panic, the new recruits of the 5th Legion on the city wall were completely reborn from the ashes. Except for a dozen soft-hearted recruits who were directly scared crazy by the bloody battlefield, the others gradually adapted to the cruel battlefield after the first day of fighting. Therefore, starting from the second day, the new recruits of the 5th Legion on the city wall became more and more stable. Even if the British army broke through a small section of the city wall again, they did not almost collapse like on the first day, but calmly organized a counterattack and drove the British army off the city wall again. In this way, every day, the British army under the city wall and the French army and German mercenaries in the city could feel the growth and changes of the new recruits of the 5th Legion. Could it be that the city defense war can really make the new recruits grow quickly? Several French officers who had been watching the battle on the high building inside the city wall thought so. In fact, they were not wrong. With the help of veterans, fighting a city defense battle with not too big a gap in strength is indeed a good way for new recruits to grow. However, this method is not as obvious as several French officers have seen. Because ordinary new recruits have never received the strict and solid basic training like the army of the Grand Duchy of the North Sea. If the foundation is too poor, even if the relatively safe city defense battle can train people, it is impossible to improve too much. Only like the 5th Legion, which has solid military basic skills and the assistance of veterans, can it improve so quickly in a city defense battle that will not lose. In the final analysis, many skills and experiences have been trained by officers. However, they will inevitably forget them because of nervousness when they go to the battlefield for the first time. But as their nervousness is overcome, they will recall the basic military knowledge taught by the instructors and verify it. In this way, their improvement will be so obvious. Moreover, the way the Grand Duchy of the North Sea selects new recruits is very special. In this era, the general army selects those who look strong to serve as soldiers. But Marin's selection method is different. Marin believes that military skills can be cultivated and the body can be trained. However, a brave and fearless character cannot be trained. Therefore, when selecting soldiers, the officers who select soldiers will let the applicants fight each other. The officers of the Grand Duchy of the North Sea don't want those who have only bodies but shrink back and are afraid of being injured. Because people who are timid in this kind of training are easy to collapse on the battlefield. Only those ruthless people who are not afraid of being injured or even dying in fighting are the favorites of officers. Such a big fool likes to play with people on the battlefield. Even if such people are selected, more than a dozen recruits were scared silly on the first day of the city defense battle. Then, those with poor psychological quality were eliminated. Even if they can recover, they can only be civilians. Most people have successfully overcome the discomfort of the first battle and are getting more and more used to the battlefield. On a hill 10 kilometers west of York City, Marin and his trusted General Schwartz are watching the battle with the latest high-definition telescopes. This new high-definition telescope is made of transparent glass smelted from sulfuric acid, a byproduct of Cuban laterite nickel ore processing, after washing powdered quartz sand, and has very good light transmittance. Unlike the previous green glass, which can only see blurry scenes 3 to 5 kilometers away. This optical glass, which uses sulfuric acid to dissolve iron ions, has much better light transmittance than green glass without removing iron ions. Even if you stand 10 kilometers away, you can see the general situation on the walls of York City. Of course, the premise is that it is sunny and there must be no fog. At this time, the attack and defense of York City has been going on for 7 days, but Marin is still holding back. Schwartz suggested hesitantly. "Master, should we send troops to attack the British army now?" If we keep fighting like this, there will be a lot of casualties. Siege warfare is very cruel. Even if the defenders have the city walls as cover, there are still hundreds of casualties every day. Even if those brave attackers who climbed up to the top of the city walls are beaten down, they will still cause casualties to the defenders on the top of the city walls. After all, the battlefield is ruthless, and no matter how careful the soldiers defending the city are, they may be injured by the enemy attacking the city. Sometimes it's because of bad luck, and sometimes it's because they encounter the opponent's fierce generals. So, getting injured is inevitable. Schwartz is worried that if time goes on for too long, there will be too many casualties among the recruits, which will lead to the collapse of the army's morale. After all, they are new recruits, not veterans, and their psychological endurance is not very strong. Marin shook his head and said, "Don't worry, wait and see." Chapter 676, The Conquest of America. Marin is not blind. Although he can't see the expressions of the recruits on the city wall 10 kilometers away, he has observed these days and found that the recruits of the 5th Legion guarding the city wall are getting more and more handy. In the first 2 or 3 days, the British army that attacked the city often found loopholes on the city wall and occupied a section of the city wall. Although the British army will eventually be driven down, it has also posed a threat to the city wall. However, as the recruits became more and more adapted, this situation rarely occurred. On the 7th day of the siege, Marin only found that there was only one dangerous situation on the top of the city, and it was quickly dealt with. Marin was very happy to watch the growth of these new recruits of the 5th Legion. In order to better train these recruits, Marin even modified the plan to launch an attack after 7 days and decided to wait a few more days. Although this week's siege is estimated to have caused more than 1,000 casualties to the recruits. But Marin is not worried. Why? Because the 5th Army has a mature battlefield medical team. This mature medical team has enough clean gauze wrapped in oil paper bags, as well as a large amount of medical alcohol. Both are byproducts of ergoto production, that is, the more choking parts of the pot head and pot tail, and sufficient gold wound medicine prepared by Morigen and Bader. As long as they are not fatally injured or disabled, they can basically be saved. In the old army of the same era, it was a miracle that half of the wounded on the battlefield could survive. And in Marin's army, this survival rate is more than half. In order to prevent the French from learning this, the wounded of the 5th Army were carried to the martial law field hospital for confidential treatment. Therefore, the French in the city did not know the means of the 5th Army to treat the wounded. Otherwise, these French guys would definitely report to Louis XII. As for whether the French would discover the miracle of the high survival rate of the wounded later, Marin was not very worried. Why? Because the wounded on the battlefield generally do not die after leaving the battlefield, but after the wound is infected, they will die after suffering from illness for a long time. But Marin will not wait for a long time. In a few days, he will get rid of the British troops outside York. Then, the 5th Corps and the French can go their separate ways. By then, who knows the survival rate of the wounded in the 5th Corps? It is precisely because of this confidence that Marin plans to postpone it for a few more days to let the new recruits of the 5th Corps get more familiar with the battlefield atmosphere. You know, this relatively safe training atmosphere is hard to come by. Just as fierce urban offensive and defensive battles broke out inside and outside York, far away in the American colonies, on the island of Cuba, battles between colonial troops and indigenous peoples also broke out. Of the 600 soldiers who went to Cuba, 300 of them had been hunters in the Black Forest, and they were all experts in tracking and shooting. The other 300 people were also old residents of the Black Forest and were no strangers to the jungle. Moreover, Marin sent them to Cuba last year. However, until now, in mid to late May of the second year, these people have started to take action. Why? Acclimatization. It's all tears. Marin has considered it carefully and eliminated those who are afraid of heat. However, the climate difference between Cuba and Germany is too big. One is a tropical rainforest and the other is a temperate black forest. They are completely two different worlds. So, after the 600 jungle warriors arrived on the island of Cuba after 3 or 4 months of boat travel, the first thing they did was to get sick collectively. Of course, it was not a fatal disease, but a minor disease caused by acclimatization. Although it was not fatal, it was enough to make 600 people lose most of their combat effectiveness. In desperation, Havana Governor Terra had to support these uncles first, serving them with ginger and brown sugar every day to help them recover. After several months of cultivation and adaptation, these uncles gradually adapted to the climate of Cuba. Then, they began to tentatively find some small tribes near Havana to practice. Because of the presence of 300 forest hunters and some Alsatian wolfhounds, those local small tribes could not even escape after being defeated. After all, it was easy for the native warriors to escape, but it was difficult for the old, weak, women and children in their village to escape. Following their scent, the Alsatian wolfhounds, the ancestors of the German shepherds, could easily find them. By the way, when they first arrived in Cuba, the symptoms of these Alsatian wolfhounds were more severe than those of humans, and they were almost too sick to move. Of course, the expeditionary army did not harm the Cuban natives. After suppressing some fiercely resisting warriors with clockwork muskets, most of the natives were captured. Those natives were not weak in combat power. But they had never seen a musket. The flames and smoke from the muskets, as well as the thunderous noise, scared these native warriors so much that they lost their way. Even once, Terra found that the number one warrior of an indigenous tribe was scared to the point of peeing his pants by the loud noise of the musket. No, the natives had no pants, but they wet the leaves and animal skins wrapped around their lower bodies. With the huge power of the volley guns and the earth-shaking noise, the local tribes were no match for the expeditionary army. Even if they wanted to set up an ambush, they would be discovered by the alertness of the Alsatian wolfhounds. And the traps were all discovered by the forest hunters one by one. This war could not be fought. The local tribes were either defeated and captured, or fled in advance. By the end of June, after a month, the Cuban expeditionary force had defeated 20 Taino tribes and captured more than 7,000 people. The area controlled was almost 5,000 to 6,000 square kilometers, roughly equivalent to most of the Havana province and Havana city in later generations. Further places could not be controlled temporarily because the jungle could not be walked far. However, Terra was not disappointed. Because 5,000 to 6,000 square kilometers of land was already large enough. You know, the two North American islands that Terra managed before were only about 500 square kilometers in total. The 5,000 to 6,000 square kilometers around Havana were more than 10 times the area he managed before. As long as it was developed well, there would be a lot of land. Moreover, the freshwater resources on the island of Cuba were very sufficient. Not only was there abundant rainfall, but there were also many rivers, which were very suitable for agriculture. At the same time, the terrain near Havana is still very flat. After conquering thousands of square kilometers of the surrounding area, Terra took the strong men directly and asked the warriors to escort the captured Taino strong men to cut trees together. On this island full of tropical rainforests, only by cutting down the trees and digging out the roots can it be reclaimed into farmland. Of course, Terra also plans to send professionals to process and preserve the wood suitable for shipbuilding in preparation for future shipbuilding needs. But the problem is that Cuba is a tropical area, and the tree species here are very different from those on the North American continent. When they were on the two islands in North America, Terra and his men could distinguish the white oak and the red oak that Marin had specifically told them about, and preserve these two trees suitable for shipbuilding intact in preparation for shipbuilding. However, the wood in the Cuban forest is all tropical tree species, and Terra and his men mostly don't know which trees' wood is suitable for shipbuilding. Therefore, Terra was helpless and prepared to write a letter to Marin for help, asking Marin to send a few shipbuilding craftsmen with good vision and rich experience to identify the local trees on Cuba Island and see which trees are suitable for shipbuilding. In this way, Terra can also preserve the logs suitable for shipbuilding for a year or two for shipbuilding. As for those that are not suitable for shipbuilding, they can be burned directly as firewood. Or, they can be used to build houses and make ordinary furniture. As for Manhattan Island in New York, which is under Albert's jurisdiction, although Marin sent thousands of soldiers, because there are relatively few forest hunters, the army is still in the training and adaptation stage. The climate in New York is not bad, and only a few of the people sent there have problems with acclimatization. After all, they are in the same temperate zone. However, because there are too few hunters in this unit who were originally from the Black Forest, most of them need to receive forest adaptation training from the dozens of soldiers who were originally Black Forest hunters. It is not yet time to launch an attack on the Mohicans. Now, they have just stepped out of Manhattan Island and are exploring northward along the Hudson River. They will not launch an attack until they reach the Mohican territory. Chapter 677, Sivag's Intuition. In York, the French commander, Knight François, was puzzled by Sivag's insistence on not letting the French army participate in the war. After all, if experienced French soldiers participated in the defense of the city walls would be more stable. But Sivag always disagreed and only let the French army go to the city walls to help in critical moments. In addition, Sivag asked Knight François to send 4,000 French soldiers to guard the night every night to prevent the British army from attacking at night. After following Marin for a while, Sivag attached great importance to night attacks and prevention of night attacks. Of course, the French also attach great importance to it. After all, their predecessor, King Charles VIII, was defeated by Marin's night attack. And the French army also added a mechanism to prevent night attacks after that battle. However, the mechanism to prevent night attacks requires a lot of people to reverse day and night to guard the night, which is not conducive to the overall combat effectiveness. And Sivag arranged half of the French army to help the profession, so there is no need to send his own recruits to guard the night. In this way, with no one's biological clock disordered in the 5th Legion, everyone's combat effectiveness was maintained very well. And the French were also happy to be idle. Because there was no danger in night duty. If Henry VII or Thomas Stanley, a sinister person, led the army, there might be a night attack, but Henry Percy, an impulsive young man, had a serious chivalrous mentality and preferred to defeat the enemy in an upright manner. So, 7,000 Frenchmen were divided into two groups. One group of 4,000 people was responsible for night duty, and the other group of 3,000 people was responsible for helping to defend the city during the day. If you see a loophole, go and help. A few days ago, the French helped the 5th Legion many times, but after a week, the French became more and more idle and could not find any opportunities. Other French soldiers didn't care, because they were not very willing to fight for Edward. Someone helped to defend the city and they were not needed, wouldn't that be better? But Knight François was a little unhappy. Why? Because he remembered Edward's promise. Edward had promised that as long as Knight François helped him defend York City, he would reward him with a count. If the French army he commanded had no chance to show up, how could he ask Edward for the title of count? Everything was done by Sivag's people, and he was worried that the title would be taken away by Sivag. So, Knight François began to discuss the issue of rotation with Sivag. But Sivag did not agree, but evaded the issue and said he would talk about it in 2 days. General Sivag, your soldiers suffered heavy casualties. Why don't you let us help defend the city? François asked curiously. According to the order of His Majesty Edward, I am training the troops. Sivag had thought about the response plan a long time ago, and the answer came naturally. Sivag did not tell François that he was a Frisian, and the French did not know that Sivag's 5th Legion was Marin's. This was something Marin had specifically explained. Marin wanted the French to think that this new army was prepared by Edward. In this way, when these Frenchmen return home, they will tell Louis XII that Edward has already prepared a new army of 10,000 people. Then, Edward will be suspected by Louis XII of having premeditated, and Marin himself will be whitewashed by the French. After all, although Sivag's 10,000 troops are all new recruits, they are trained at a glance. If Louis XII knew that Marin had 10,000 new English recruits and had prepared them a few months ago, he might guess that Marin had ulterior motives. Training troops. Knight François was puzzled for a while, but soon his eyes lit up. This is indeed a good way to train troops. The city defense battle is not dangerous, and the new recruits are not easy to collapse. It's a good idea. No, I have to report to His Majesty. Knight François said excitedly. The Majesty he was talking about was naturally not Edward, but Louis XII. But Sivag poured cold water on him. General François, it's not that simple. Where is it not simple? François was a little puzzled. Sivag raised a finger and said. First of all, these 10,000 new soldiers are used to defend the city. If there are no veterans to support them, they may collapse. The reason why I dare to train soldiers in York City is because there are 10,000 veterans behind the city wall. Even if we collapse, you can help drive the enemy back. Knight François thought about it and nodded to show his agreement. But he soon said excitedly. This is also good. In the future, we will let the new soldiers defend the city and the veterans support the city. In this way, using the brutal siege war, we can indeed quickly train new soldiers. He has seen the improvement of the soldiers of the 5th Legion in these days. Sivag shook his head, raised his second finger, and said. That's not the case. There is a second prerequisite for us to train soldiers like this. The second condition? What is that? Sivag asked anxiously. If he could summarize a good way to train soldiers and report it to King Louis XII of France, his title would definitely be improved. The second condition is that the enemy outside the city does not know that there are 20,000 troops in the city. If they knew that there are 10,000 veterans and 10,000 new soldiers in York City now, they would never dare to attack the city so confidently. Sivag said slowly. To put it bluntly, the British army lacked intelligence. After all, the British army had lost control of Yorkshire for almost 2 years, so the intelligence work was naturally not in place. Moreover, the 5th Legion hid during the day and traveled at night, choosing small paths to come to York City, which was very concealed. Knight Francois thought about it, and it was indeed the case. If he led his troops to attack the city and knew that the enemy troops defending the city were as many as himself, he would definitely be much more cautious. The British army outside the city probably did not know that there were also 20,000 troops in the city at this time, so they were so confident in attacking. No wonder you didn't let our army go up to the city wall together, it turned out that you were afraid of scaring the other side. Knight Francois suddenly realized. So, General Francois, if you want to train new soldiers and let them exercise by defending the city, you must keep it secret and let the other side not know the existence of the new soldiers. Otherwise, the other side will not be willing to play with you when they know that you have a lot of troops. Or, they will take other measures. Sivag did not hide his secrets and enthusiastically shared his experience with Knight Francois. However, if you think Sivag is selfless or stupid, you are wrong. It's not that Sivag is selfless and generous, but that Sivag understands that this knight named Francois will not return to France alive. As a middle-aged veteran and a person with rich political experience, Sivag knew that this promise would be difficult to fulfill when he learned that Edward promised to confer the title of Count on Francois. However, it is unlikely that Edward, a future king, would default on his debt. Therefore, the best way is to let Knight Francois die reasonably after success. In this way, Edward can save an earldom and a large fiefdom. Sivag doesn't know whether Edward is a ruthless monarch, but he at least knows that his monarch Marin is absolutely ruthless. Even if Edward doesn't take action, Marin will probably help deal with this young French knight. You know, the 5th Legion began to be quietly formed last year. Even Edward didn't discuss it with Marin at that time. It can be seen that Marin has long been plotting against England. Moreover, Sivag has a terrible intuition. He feels that his master Marin may not be plotting against Northumberland and the Isle of Wight as agreed with Edward, but the whole of England. Sivag knew that Marin had secured the second marriage right for his son Caesar with Edward's only daughter, Princess Margaret. Although he didn't quite understand why Marin dared to bet that Louis XII would not have a son and Edward would not have a son, Sivag's intuition told him that Marin must have a way to do this. And this intuition was Sivag's biggest reliance on being able to survive after all 8 of his former masters had died. Chapter 678, Plywood Ships and Night Raid Preparations. Sivag's intuition was indeed very accurate. On the same night when he and Knight Francois discussed the training methods for new recruits, Edward discussed with Marin how to get rid of Knight Francois. Grand Duke Marin, I didn't know that you had raised a new army of new recruits before, and I was afraid that the 7,000 French troops would rebel, so in order to stabilize the French army, I casually promised a count to Knight Francois. But I'm afraid. It's not that I don't keep my promise, but that he is French. If the French become a powerful earl with a county in England, they will definitely collude with Louis XII to invade England again. Marin was silent for a while, and then asked. So, what does your Majesty mean? I know you have a lot of ideas, so I want to ask you, is there any way to regret it? After all, it is too dangerous to let a French officer be a land earl in England. In fact, Edward really wanted to ask Marin how to kill Francois. However, for fear of scaring Marin, he used a more euphemistic statement. Marin lowered his head and thought for a while, then replied. How about, Your Majesty, and feth him to the island of Ireland? You can abolish the original Earl of Kildare and confer this title on Francois. This. I am also worried. Francois will collude with the French and annex the island of Ireland. To put it bluntly, Edward wants to completely default on his debt. Sure enough, he is not a good thing. Marin snorted in his heart. However, speaking of it, he, Marin, is even less of a good thing. In fact, as the current number one conspirator in Europe, Marin knows very well that Edward has murdered Knight Francois. As someone who will get Northumberland and the Isle of Wight from Edward in the future, Marin also feels a little sad about this. However, Marin is not worried that Edward will murder him. Because, for now, Edward can't do anything without him. If he is killed by him, the soldiers of the Grand Duchy of the North Sea can chop Edward into meat sauce at any time. The only thing to worry about is Edward's black-bellied sister. The other party got a very powerful chronic poison. What Marin feared most was that he would die from that chronic poison. Fortunately, Marin had long planned to take the initiative and kill Princess Margaret. Therefore, he was not worried about his own safety, at least it was completely fine now. Moreover, after helping Edward ascend the throne, Marin did not plan to stay in Britain for a long time, nor would he give Edward a chance to attack. However, the French are indeed the common enemy of both sides at present. Therefore, Marin finally decided to help Edward think of an idea. Then, Your Majesty, can this Knight Francois swim? Edward thought about it and said. No, the 7,000 French soldiers and senior officers are all knights. And the French knights are basically landlubbers, and few can swim. Only the lower-level French soldiers, who were born as fishermen, are good at swimming. How, is there a way? Well, I thought of a way, we can make a special boat. Then, Marin began to describe it in detail. The method is very simple, which Marin learned from The Legend of the Condor Heroes. Huang Yaoshi built a gorgeous flower boat to bury himself in the sea so that he could accompany his dead wife in the underworld. The boat looked fine on the outside, but it was actually very fragile and would soon fall apart in the face of wind and waves. This was because the boat was glued together, not nailed together. Gluing wood together is of course fine when it is still, but once it encounters wind and waves, it will soon be a tragedy. Edward also said that French knights are all landlubbers, so those landlubber French knights were specially concentrated on the wooden boats glued together, and the fishermen's children who could swim were not allowed to mix in. When they arrived in the middle of the English Channel, with the level of wind and waves in the English Channel, the boat would definitely fall apart. By then, all the French officers on the ship will have to feed the fish. What if French soldiers who can swim on a nearby ship come to rescue us? It's very simple, let our sailors drive the ship. When it is in the middle of the English Channel, let the sailors driving the ship deliberately distance the ship from other ships. By the time other ships realize something is wrong and rush over, those French knights will have almost all sunk. As for our sailors, they all know how to swim, and they will definitely be able to hold on until the rescue ship arrives. This plan is so vicious, but it's pretty good. Edward suddenly realized, this Marin is really vicious. He only wanted to shirk his debt and murder Knight Francois alone, while Marin directly planned to kill all the 7,000 French officers, but it would be so satisfying. Marin sneered in his heart, if a ship full of officers drowned, then Britain and France would be even more irreconcilable. As for himself, he could watch the quarrel between England and France with a smile. After Louis XII died, the limelight had passed, and Marin could take over England by cleaning up Edward. Louis XII died in 1515, which was about 10 years later. With these 10 years, Marin would definitely be able to grow and develop. By then, even if it was France, Marin would have the capital to fight against it. At that time, taking over England would not be afraid of the pressure from France. As for Edward, Marin really didn't care. His balls were kicked and broken, and even if he was given 20 years, he would not have another child. As long as Princess Margaret was fine, his son's joint rule over England would be stable. However, Edward did not have a shipyard now, so he naturally could not make the kind of ship that was bonded with pure glue. Therefore, this task had to fall into Marin's hands. For this reason, Marin sent people to Newcastle and asked them to send a ship back to Emden Port to notify the shipyard to get such a ship out. Of course, the structural wood was processed and glue and paint were prepared. After Edward takes London, the materials will be sent to England for temporary assembly and bonding. Otherwise, it will be useless even if it is bonded in Emden. Once it enters the sea, it will still fall apart. Only when it is sent to the British port and temporarily bonded can it be used. Moreover, the chance of falling apart is greater with temporary bonding. If it is bonded for a long time, it may be very strong. However, during this period of time, the Emden shipyard can test how long it will take for such a ship to fall apart. It is best to hold on to the middle of the sea before falling apart. Otherwise, if it falls apart too early, those French knights will fall into the sea before leaving the coast of England, and it will be easy to be rescued. After discussing the use of plywood to trap French officers, Marin began to arrange night adaptation training for his troops. Edward asked curiously. "Why do you train your soldiers at night?" Marin answered calmly. "Because I am going to attack Henry Percy's army at night." "What?" Edward was shocked. "Your army is so powerful. Why do you want to attack the enemy at night? It's unnecessary, right?" In Edward's opinion, Marin's army is stronger than Henry Percy's 20,000 British troops. If he can win in a head-on attack, what about a surprise attack from behind? But Marin is too shameless. He is sure to win, but he still shamelessly attacks at night. Marin knows that Edward must despise him, but he said nonchalantly. "Your Majesty, Henry Percy has 6 or 7,000 elite longbowmen. If we attack them during the day, their longbowmen will rain arrows for a few times, and my men will definitely suffer a lot of casualties. If we attack them at night while they are asleep, it will be difficult for their longbowmen to form a formation and fire arrows. In this way, my men can reduce a lot of casualties." Edward nodded, but still felt a little bit uneasy. "It's just that this will damage our reputation." "Reputation? I don't care, I just want to win." Marin answered firmly. He is a believer in the white cat, black cat theory, and reputation is nothing. Moreover, he made his fortune by attacking Charles VIII's French army at night. His reputation has long been tarnished, so what's the harm in getting even tarnished? Chapter 679, Stealing the Camp. Fighting at night is a great test of the quality of soldiers. Soldiers with poor quality can easily go crazy under the dual effects of darkness and fear. Therefore, even after several successful night attacks, Marin did not dare to be careless and conducted several days of night attack adaptation training for the army. In fact, Marin's First Corps is very adaptable to field battles. They have fought many major battles with Marin, and night attacks are child's play. Moreover, their daily training includes subjects of night attacks and anti-night attacks. But Sakara's Fourth Corps is not so experienced. It has only attacked the Bossa coalition once under the leadership of the Schleswig Corps. Although successful, it was also a bit risky at the time. The most important thing is actually the coordination problem between the First Corps and the Fourth Corps at night. After all, the two corps, one is the German Corps and the other is the English Corps. If the coordination is not good, it is easy to accidentally hurt each other at night when visibility is very low. This kind of thing will not happen during the day, but it is hard to say at night. Therefore, Marin's night attack training in the past few days is not basic training, but coordination training between the two corps at night. To this end, Marin specially arranged a dozen Frisians who knew both German and English like Frisian as the people who shouted and coordinated between the two legions. Fortunately, there were many Frisian officers in the English Legion of Sakara, who knew both German and English. Therefore, this kind of night coordination training was done in 3 or 4 days. At this time, the offensive and defensive Battle of York City had been fought for 11 days. Marin felt that the recruits of the 5th Legion in the city had been trained almost enough, so he decided to officially start the night attack. Early in the morning of the 12th day, the two legions began to move towards York City. That night, they arrived in the jungle west of York City. After a simple meal of the black bread that had been prepared long ago, the soldiers began to rest and prepare to launch an attack in the second half of the night. In the middle of the night, the soldiers were called up by the officers, and they all put on their clothes and prepared to set off. Looking at the sky, it was exactly half a moon at this time. Although the light was small, it was better than no light. You know, in order to ensure the success of the night attack, the army cannot advance with torches. Otherwise, it is easy to be discovered and warned by the enemy sentries from a distance. Therefore, the first principle of the night attack is to choose to march under the conditions of moonlight. Of course, if it is like the Fornovo ambush, waiting for the enemy to pass by on the top of the slope, that is another matter. Because there is no need to march, it doesn't matter whether there is moonlight or not. With the faint moonlight, the soldiers, led by the officers, carefully moved towards the British camp. The layout of the British camp is still the same old one. Slanted wooden stakes are always the standard outside the camp. Because there are many troops and they think they are strong, this time the British camp was too lazy to dig tunnels outside, so they retained the British characteristic slanted wooden stakes. Therefore, Marin's army saved a lot of trouble. For example, there is no need to fill the pit. In order to open the British fence wall and to create great chaos for the British army, Marin also brought the Royal Demolition Team Donitsrui and his dozens of professional men. Donitsrui personally led the team and commanded his men to select several weak points of British defense and sent people to bury gunpowder barrels under the fence. Because they were professional, it took only 1 hour for all 5 groups to complete the burial of gunpowder barrels without alarming the British army. Then, Marin asked people to light a fire in a hidden place, lit 5 fuses, hid them in a breathable wooden box, and let the demolition hands take them back to the vicinity of the British fence. At the same time, the army was divided into 5 groups and followed the demolition team forward. At about 4 o'clock in the morning, it was still dark, the moon was still in the sky, but the east was slightly white. This was July, and it would be light at more than 4 o'clock. After arriving at the designated location, as a Kongming lantern rose into the sky, the demolition hands at 5 locations began to ignite at the same time. Boom 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 dash, 5 loud noises came at the same time, shaking the earth. All the soldiers in the British camp were awakened, and even the defenders in York were awakened. What's going on? What happened? Many British soldiers asked in panic. However, before they could get the exact news, there were shouts of killing all around the camp. Henry Percy was shocked. Didn't I send sentries to watch the direction of York City? Why is there a night attack? Henry Percy was not unprepared. In order to prevent the army in the city from attacking at night or escaping at night, he sent more than a dozen scouts to monitor the 4 gates of York City overnight. However, he did not expect that there would be an enemy behind him. So, after being awakened, the first thing Henry Percy did was to go out and inquire about the situation. However, at this time, the whole camp was confused by the enemy's shouts of killing. How could he find out anything useful? The most correct approach should be to loudly order the army to stabilize and organize resistance in a concentrated manner in the camp. However, Henry Percy was only 27 years old and relatively immature. Moreover, he had never encountered a habitual night attack offender like Marin, so he naturally did not pay much attention to the prevention of night attacks. If it were Marin's old rivals in Germany, they would definitely be on high alert at night. Now, because of the fear of Marin's night raid, the armies of many German states are equipped with watchdogs to help guard the night. If there is a night raid, even if the sentry can't find it, the watchdog can feel it. Therefore, in Germany, Marin's night raids are becoming more and more difficult to get through, but in England, because night raids are not popular, prevention work is also not in place. The enemy is coming. Run for your life. Yes, there are so many people. We can't beat them, everyone run away. In the darkness, there was this very demoralizing shout. Yes, this was arranged by Marin. The soldiers of the 4th Legion are basically English, and when they shout, they naturally speak in authentic English accents. In the chaos, the English soldiers couldn't see who was shouting, so they naturally thought it was their own people. Therefore, some officers originally planned to organize resistance on their own. However, this kind of demoralizing and bewitching shouting directly disrupted the army's morale. As a result, the unprepared English soldiers began to run around like headless flies. And Marin's army was led by sword and shield soldiers. When they saw someone, they would hit him with a wooden shield, and when they saw someone holding a weapon, they would directly give him a knife. Marin had ordered before that when he saw the British soldiers without weapons, he would hit them with wooden shields and drive them to attack the enemy camp. If he encountered someone holding a weapon and knew how to resist, he would kill them directly with a knife. Those British soldiers who rushed out without taking their weapons, deliberately driven by Marin's soldiers, rushed to the camps that formed a defensive formation under the command of officers. At this time, the British camp was full of chaos. However, there were also some capable officers. After they woke up, they knew that something was wrong, and they did not rush to find the commander, but decisively ordered the surrounding soldiers to find weapons, and then move closer to them to form a defensive formation. Moreover, they kept the formation and moved towards the main coach's tent. However, how could the sneak attacking Marin's army give them the opportunity to gather? Under the deliberate drive of the sword and shield soldiers, many British soldiers who were running around without weapons involuntarily rushed towards the orderly enemy small squares, blocking their way to the center. Chapter 680, A Great Victory. At this time, the commander Henry Percy, who lacked experience in leading troops, was completely frightened. He saw enemies everywhere and it was difficult to count their numbers. So, he was scared and at a loss. However, there were still capable officers in the British Army. The adjutant knight Hulk stood up at this time. Hulk was originally a subordinate of Richard Bull and had good military qualities. Moreover, Hulk had fought many battles with Richard Bull, including the battle to defeat the false Richard in 1497. Hulk, who also studied night attacks and counter-night attacks, knew that only by keeping his position steady could he try to counterattack. It was already about 4:30 in the morning and it was already dawn. As long as we hold on for a while and the soldiers calm down, we can counterattack. So Hulk climbed to a high place and shouted loudly. Officers of each battalion, gather the soldiers on the spot to form a formation to resist. Then, move closer to the center in an orderly manner. Marin also heard Hulk shouting, and he was surprised. This kid is very capable, and he responded very well. What's the use of being well behaved, look at me. Sakara was next to Marin, and he had many English archery masters under his command. Sakara turned his head, called a few English archers, pointed at Hulk standing on a high place and said, "Shoot him to death for me." Several English archery masters nodded, and at a distance of 100 meters, they pulled the English longbow and aimed at Hulk who was still shouting. Officers of each battalion, gather the soldiers on the spot to form a formation to resist. Then, move closer to the center in an orderly manner. Hulk shouted again, but just as he was about to shout for the third time, the sound of whoosh 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 broke through the air in the sky. Then, several long arrows magnified in Hulk's eyes until they were all stuck in his body. Hulk groaned and fell headfirst from a height, and his shouting stopped abruptly. Damn, I forgot to wear plate armor. This was Hulk's last thought. However, it was no wonder, he was busy commanding the army to gather and counterattack, so how could he have time to wear the troublesome plate armor? Marin originally planned to use a musket, but after looking at the distance, at a distance of hundreds of meters, a bow and arrow would be more accurate. Because, a smoothbore musket is very difficult to aim at more than 50 meters. Therefore, it is not as accurate as the longbowman under Sakara. But Hulk's words finally took effect, although many British soldiers were running around under the morale-destroying and deceptive shouting of the English soldiers of the 4th Legion. However, under the pressure of some British officers who heard Hulk's call, many British soldiers, out of fear of their superiors, still obeyed the order, found weapons, and formed some small squares to resist the impact of Marin's army. Oh, there are many capable people. But, that's all. After saying that, Marin turned around and waved his hand, calling the musketeers. Go, attack those British troops who are forming a formation to protect themselves, and pay special attention to shooting and killing the commanders. Several musketeer commanders immediately took their men, holding the clockwork muskets that had just been replaced not long ago, and went around looking for the enemy troops in formation. Marin's soldiers were all wearing white vests with black crosses, which were more conspicuous. In addition, it was dawn now, and everyone basically would not accidentally hurt their own people. Then, the scattered musketeers, including the English archers of the 4th Legion, hid behind the sword and shield soldiers, aimed at the British troops in formation, and began to pull the trigger and shoot arrows. For those British troops who formed small formations, or the gunners paid more attention to aiming and shooting at the British commanders who were shouting and organizing resistance. Listen to my orders, hold up your spears horizontally, and stab all the blockers. Then, march to the central tent. A British officer just finished shouting, and there was a big blood hole on his body with a pop, and blood splashed all over the faces of the British soldiers around him. The lethality of spherical lead bullets is very terrifying. The bullets of the spring-type flintlocks equipped by Marin for his men weigh 30 grams, which are based on the standard of the Brown Bess flintlock during the war. According to this standard, 1 pound of lead blocks can make 15 spherical lead bullets, and the caliber of the musket is about 19.3 millimeters. Although it is 2/5 less than the 50-gram bullet of the Spanish musket, it is still very powerful. Moreover, the whole gun no longer looks bulky, and it does not need to be supported by a bracket to shoot. Marin believes that the British must have his reasons for choosing this caliber and bullet weight later. The French army of the same period used a standard of 20 bullets per pound of lead, weighing 22.67 grams, which was much less powerful than the British muskets and lacked the impact of plate armor. There were many plate armor knights in this era. In order to deal with plate armor and facilitate the marching and assault of musketeers, Marin finally chose the caliber of the British standard Brown Bess flintlock rifle after weighing the two. The 30-gram lead bullet was also very powerful. Like Hulk, the officer who shouted did not even have time to wear plate armor, and hurried out. When he encountered a musket that was more powerful than a bow and arrow, he was shot directly in the chest, and a huge blood hole appeared. Probably because he hit the artery, the blood pressure was relatively high, and the blood spurted out directly, which was very scary. After this guy was shot, the small group of British soldiers around him were dumbfounded. The officer died tragically, and they were suddenly leaderless. Coupled with the demoralizing shouts of the 4th Legion soldiers who were specifically shouting, this group of people immediately dropped their weapons and scattered like birds and beasts. Just when Marin was looking at the British army running around triumphantly, suddenly a feather arrow flew at a very fast speed from the left front and shot at Marin's chest, making a duong sound. Marin was so scared that he turned his head and looked. It turned out that not far from the left front, a small group of British troops had gathered. This was not the most important thing. The most important thing was that this small group of British troops were all longbow soldiers. Graham, the leader of the archer squad, saw that Marin's clothes and armor were bright and he was surrounded by people, so he concluded that this was a big shot and should be a senior general of the enemy army, or even the chief commander. So he quietly drew his bow and aimed at Marin. Unfortunately, Marin was wearing an easily recognizable white Emperor black cross vest, and Graham didn't know that there was a breastplate armor inside the vest, so he aimed at Marin's heart. Unfortunately, a duong sound broke Graham's dream of killing Marin in seconds. You know, Graham shot the arrow from 50 meters away. As the captain of the archers and the sharpshooter, he has a good eye. Even though it was not yet dawn, he used the half-bright light at 4 or 5 o'clock to find Marin, who was the center of attention, from a group of generals. However, Graham didn't know that Marin, a coward, was wearing high manganese steel plate armor, which was made of high-strength high manganese steel smelted by pyrolusite and iron ore produced in Hungary. Facing the bow and arrow, there was nothing wrong, only the white-bottomed black cross vest on the outside was shot through. Even if the musket hit Marin's high manganese steel breastplate armor, it would at most injure Marin, but not be fatal. If it was shot at Marin's face, that little gap might have killed Marin. But there are not so many ifs in this world. Graham missed his shot, and Marin retreated decisively, surrounded by a group of muscle sticks wearing plate armor. Khan, on the other hand, angrily rushed towards Graham's archer squad 50 meters away with a mace in hand. The young master was shot with an arrow right under his nose, which was like a slap in his face. So Khan went berserk. Khan, whose fighting power was no less than Jian Wei, was absolutely invincible. Although he was wearing a full set of high manganese steel plate armor, Khan was still extremely agile. Khan, wearing plate armor, rushed over within 10 seconds at a distance of 50 meters. He knocked away anyone who blocked his way. When he came to Graham, Khan shouted angrily, "You deserve to die." Then, he used his mace to crush poor Graham. Under the watch of the surrounding terrified British longbowmen, Khan was still not satisfied and continued to smash Graham's already flattened body to vent his rage. After completely smashing Graham, Khan had not vented his anger yet, and then he roared at the surrounding English longbowmen. "My God, devil!" The surrounding English longbowmen immediately fled in all directions. Khan did not chase him. With his anger value full, he directly rushed to the British Central Army tent with his mace. Under the violent attack of Khan, the human-shaped bullet, the British soldiers guarding the British Central Army tent retreated step by step. After Marin recovered from his shock, he saw a good opportunity and immediately rushed forward with Khan and hundreds of muscular guards around him. Of course, he was standing in the middle of these muscular men, so he was safe. At the same time, the troops behind Marin saw that the commander-in-chief was charging together, so they naturally followed suit. With Khan, the human-shaped bullet, leading the way, and the impact of hundreds of plate armored guards, the resistance team that the British Army had finally gathered near the Central Army tent was immediately dispersed. The balance of victory has completely tilted towards Marin. Henry Percy, who had just cheered up and was about to counterattack, saw the hundreds of muscular men rushing over, and the more enemy soldiers behind these hundreds of muscular men, and knew that the situation was over. He was so scared that he collapsed on the ground. When the Central Army tent was captured, the entire British camp was completely in chaos. Marin's army completely defeated the British Army in the camp and won a great victory,